During the Second World War, one of the main priorities was to keep everything hidden. Routes, movements, and facilities were kept out of sight. Caves, tunnels, sealed trains, or remote areas were often used to transport materials without the enemy noticing. When the war ended in 1945, much of that was left abandoned. No one returned to those sites. Over time, they began to emerge. They were not recreations or isolated pieces. They were real, intact objects, just as they had been left. Vehicles, maps, weapons, documents, entire structures, all of that surfaced without anyone looking for it. What was it that appeared after being hidden for so many decades? The hidden Soviet shelter that was forgotten in Latvia. In the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet bloc, several groups of explorers began to explore abandoned military areas in Eastern Europe. One of those places was in Latvia, a few kilometers from the city of Skrunda. What seemed to be just a set of empty structures hid something deeper. Underground, there were reinforced tunnels, sealed rooms, and rusted machinery that had not seen the light of day since the end of the Second World War. The entrance was covered with earth and rubble, and only a slight slope in the ground could be noticed. After removing the upper layers, a steel hatch with remnants of red paint appeared. It was stuck, but after several attempts they managed to open it. Inside, the air was dense, smelling of rust and old dust. The flashlights barely lit the corridors, which descended in a straight line about 10 meters. The underground complex had at least 4 large interconnected rooms. There were loose cables on the floor, broken pipes, and a layer of moisture covering almost everything. However, some objects were well preserved. In one of the rooms, they found shelves with toolboxes, electrical spare parts, maps marked in Russian, and technical manuals. The most striking thing was a room with walls covered in metal panels, where old telephones and rotary controls still hung. It was a communications center. There were microphones, speakers, and headphones from the time, all connected to a central console. Dust covered everything, but many pieces still had their original labels. Among the papers scattered on the floor were notebooks with notes, guard shifts, and encrypted codes. They also found a Soviet typewriter with several sheets inserted. The texts were in Russian, and some spoke of drills, maintenance, and protocols in case of air attacks. In a corner of the hallway, behind a closed steel door, they found a small armory. There were empty boxes and others with spare parts. There were no complete weapons or ammunition, but there were loose parts, magazines, mounts, and rifle accessories. Everything was recorded but not removed. The complex had artificial ventilation. The ducts ran along the ceiling, and some parts were still fixed. There were also remains of an emergency generator. Although it was rusted, its structure and the connections that supplied other parts of the shelter could still be distinguished. One of the rooms seemed to have been used as a dormitory. There were metal bunk beds, rotted mattresses, and remains of blankets. There was also a table with metal plates, a broken portable radio, and a lamp hanging from the ceiling. It was evident that the site had been occupied for a prolonged time. Experts who later visited the site concluded that it was an operational bunker active between 1944 and 1947. It was possibly used during the last months of the war as a surveillance or communication point, and then remained under Soviet control when the region was taken over. The shelter's location was strategic, away from visible routes, but close enough to an old military airfield. That allowed communications to be maintained without interference and provided quick access in case evacuation was necessary. The still visible paint markings on the walls indicated internal directions and restricted zones. The floor had wheel marks, as if carts or equipment had been moved inside. They also found remains of wooden boxes with Russian manufacturing stamps and papers attached with dates from 1945. Many were wet, but some were rescued for scanning and analysis. The site was not listed in any official record. It did not appear on maps or in publicly accessible documents. Its discovery was accidental, and the first to enter were civilian explorers, not military personnel. Later, researchers from local universities studied it more thoroughly. Some parts of the complex were partially collapsed, making further progress impossible. Telescopic cameras were used to view inaccessible areas where structures similar to storage rooms or archives were seen. Entry was not attempted for safety reasons, but the area was marked for possible future excavations. The existence of this base reinforced the theory that, in the final years of the war and the early years of Soviet control, multiple hidden command points were built, prepared to resist or communicate in the event of a major conflict. Many of them were deactivated without leaving any trace. The Skrunda bunker was closed again after its initial exploration. Security seals were placed, and it was registered as a historic site. Although it was not open to the public, the images obtained served to show how these facilities operated during the conflict and the early tension of the Cold War. The Forgotten Field Hospital in a French cave. In 2012, a group of speleologists exploring a series of caves in northern France near the Ardennes region found an entrance covered with vegetation and earth. Upon entering, they noticed that the cavern showed clear signs of human use. The ground was leveled, and chalk marks, metal hooks nailed into the walls, and remains of wooden planks could be seen. They were not facing an ordinary cave. As they advanced, they found rusted objects, medical utensils, a folding stretcher, wooden boxes with inscriptions in English, and empty morphine vials. Everything indicated that this underground space had been used as an improvised hospital during the Second World War. The most surprising thing was that many objects remained in place, as if the site had been hurriedly closed and never touched since then. The remains were well preserved by the constant humidity and lack of direct light. There were bandages, broken medicine bottles, unused syringes, and parts of uniforms with United States Army insignias. The entire place had an organized layout, an entrance area, 2 separate rooms with stretchers, an operating table, and a small area with kitchen utensils. There was no electricity in the place, but holders for kerosene lamps were found. They also found food cans, empty water bottles, blankets, and a damaged portable radio. Everything pointed to the cave having been used by a field medical group that operated in secret in that forested area during the fighting in the Ardennes. On one of the walls, a date could still be read written in charcoal, 17 December 1944, which coincided with the beginning of the German offensive in that region. During that winter, conditions were harsh, and many United States squadrons had to retreat and establish temporary posts in hidden places like caves, churches, or abandoned barns. A military report declassified years later confirmed that a United States Army medical squad had set up an emergency hospital in that sector to treat the wounded from the front lines. The team was made up of doctors, nurses, and support personnel. The goal was to treat soldiers as close as possible to the combat zones without exposing them to a long transfer. Some notes found inside the cave listed names, ages, brief diagnoses, and admission dates. A personal diary of one of the doctors was also recovered, with handwritten entries describing the conditions of the place, the extreme cold, and the shortage of resources. In one of the pages, it was mentioned that they had to operate by candlelight. No human remains were found, indicating that the wounded were transferred or buried outside the site. Even so, the level of detail in the hospital's setup showed that it was not an improvised temporary facility, but a place intended to remain active for several weeks. The entrance to the cave had been camouflaged with branches and earth, which explains why it remained undiscovered for so long. Only the natural change of the terrain allowed part of the access to become exposed and be detected by the explorers. No one had registered it before, nor did it appear on military maps. The discovery was reported to local authorities and the United States Army. A conservation team visited the site to catalogue all the objects. Photographs were taken, the walls were scanned, and written documents were recovered. Some materials were taken to a military museum in France for exhibition and analysis. Researchers concluded that this field hospital was key during a critical period of the war. The Battle of the Ardennes was one of the harshest offensives on the Western Front, and many medical posts had to adapt to natural hideouts to survive and operate. This cave was one of those points, the Japanese chest that held the last messages of war. In 2017, some workers carrying out construction on land near the coast of Okinawa found a metal object buried half a meter deep. It was a rectangular box, rusted with time, but still sealed. They thought it was an old, forgotten tool until one of them noticed Japanese inscriptions engraved on the lid. They alerted the authorities, and a team of local archaeologists took charge of the discovery. The box was opened in a laboratory under controlled conditions. Inside were dozens of envelopes wrapped in rice paper, along with small personal items. medals, photos, pieces of fabric with embroidered names, and even a small Japanese flag with several handwritten messages. Everything was well preserved. Experts confirmed it was a time capsule buried at the end of the Second World War. The documents dated back to 1945 and had been written by soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army stationed in Okinawa during the final months of the conflict. Many of the texts were letters addressed to their families, friends, or future compatriots. They spoke of the weather, the battles they expected, their fears, and the hope that someone would one day read their words. They were not official messages. They were personal, spontaneous writings, some with careless handwriting, others with extreme care. Several included drawings, short poems, and farewell phrases. One said, "If someone finds this, know that we fought for what we believed was right. Do not forget that we were also afraid." Another stated, "My name is Taro. I am 19 years old. I am burying this because I do not know if I will be alive tomorrow." The discovery was striking for the sincerity of the texts. They were not propaganda, war reports, or orders. They were confessions. Specialists translated them into modern Japanese and digitized all the content. They then contacted institutions that preserve military records to search for matches with the names found in the papers. 9 of the soldiers were identified. Some died in combat, others disappeared during the Battle of Okinawa. Only one was confirmed to have survived, and he lived in Tokyo. He was already over 90 years old. When he was informed of the discovery, he asked to see the capsule. He recognized his handwriting in one of the letters and confirmed that the group had decided to bury it before receiving the mobilization order. The box had been placed under a slab in what was an improvised shelter used by the soldiers as a meeting point. According to the veteran, they knew defeat was imminent and wanted to leave a record of what they felt at that moment. No one wanted their thoughts to be lost with them. The discovery was documented in Japan as one of the most moving related to the conflict. It had no military value or strategic data, but it did offer a direct human perspective on how ordinary Japanese soldiers lived those days, without filters or official intervention. A temporary exhibition was organized at a museum in Okinawa, where copies of the texts were shown along with the objects that accompanied the letters. A video interview with the veteran who helped contextualize the discovery was also included. Public interest was high, especially among young people who had never heard of such capsules. The texts made it clear that the soldiers knew their chances were minimal. Some even wrote about what they would like to do if they survived. One wrote that he dreamed of having a rice shop, another mentioned wanting to marry his neighbor when he returned. They were simple hopes, buried alongside a war that took everything. Beyond the archaeological impact, the capsule served to reveal the lesser-known side of the war. Not that of the high commands or the aerial battles, but that of the young recruits who wrote a few lines with the hope of not being forgotten. The phantom plane of the desert. In 2012, an Egyptian worker exploring a remote area of the Sahara Desert came across something out of place, an old airplane embedded in the sand, as if it had just made an emergency landing. It was not buried or destroyed, only weathered by sun and wind. The fuselage was still intact. On one side, part of the serial number could still be read. There were rusted weapons on the ground and remnants of personal belongings around. It was a British Curtiss Kittyhawk fighter, model P-40, one of those used by the Royal Air Force in North Africa during the Second World War. Experts confirmed that the plane had taken off in June of 1942 and never returned to its base. Its pilot, Sergeant Dennis Copping, was 24 years old and tasked with transporting the aircraft for repairs to another location in the region. He never arrived. The original flight report stated he had become disoriented, and he was listed as missing. From that day, nothing more was known about the pilot or the plane. There were no signs of impact, no radio signals, and no remains found in the area. It became just another case of disappearance in a hostile territory with no clear clues. When the plane was examined in the desert, it was confirmed that there were no combat impacts. The landing gear was damaged, but the aircraft had not crashed violently. It appeared to be a forced landing. The windshield was broken, but the rest of the main structure remained in one piece. There was scattered ammunition, a sun-dried parachute, and empty fuel cans. The most striking detail was that the cockpit interior still held original components. Some instruments were still in place. The radio, although broken, did not appear to have been removed. On the floor were a military cap, a tool case, and a canteen. No human remains were found. Following the discovery, an investigation was launched using British military records. Dates, missions, squadron names, and routes used at that time were cross-referenced. Everything indicated that the pilot, after getting lost, decided to land before running out of fuel. He would then have tried to walk out in search of help. A few kilometers from the plane, human bones were found next to a small makeshift shelter built with stones. There were also remains of military clothing, a revolver, and pieces of a canvas. It is believed that Copping walked in a straight line until he collapsed from exhaustion. He did not manage to reach any inhabited place. The discovery attracted the attention of historians and aviation experts. The plane was so well preserved that it looked like a museum model in the middle of the desert. Hundreds of photos were taken, parts of the fuselage were scanned, and all the exact coordinates were recorded. For weeks, the site was visited by British and Egyptian teams who wanted to study the surroundings. The British government wanted to recover the plane to exhibit it in a museum, but the operation turned out to be complex. It was in a hard-to-reach area with no nearby roads or signage. There was also the risk that transporting it would cause more damage than leaving it in place. They considered preserving it right where it was found, covering it with durable materials to prevent further deterioration. But over time, the aircraft was dismantled by looters who sold parts of the fuselage and internal components. Today, only scattered fragments remain where it once stood whole. Dennis Copping was officially commemorated by the British Army after his remains were identified. He had no known grave until then. His name was inscribed in the records of fallen soldiers in Africa, and his story became part of the archives of the Royal Air Force. The Phantom Plane of the Sahara was one of the most striking discoveries due to its condition, its untouched location, and the image it presented. A fighter plane standing in the middle of nowhere, a witness to a simple mission that ended with no return. A routine journey that turned into a mystery for 70 years. The I-52 submarine, the Axis lost shipment beneath the Atlantic. During the Second World War, the ocean was not only used to move goods, it was also the route the Axis powers used for discrete operations. One of the most striking cases lies buried more than 5,000 meters beneath the Atlantic. It is the Japanese submarine I-52. But it was not just any submarine. This one carried a special cargo that connected Japan and Germany at a key stage of the conflict. By that point in the war, using regular sea routes was a gamble with death. Allied attacks were everywhere. Japan and Germany, under pressure and with fewer and fewer options, still needed to exchange what little they had. Germany wanted raw materials that were scarce in Europe: rubber, tin, tungsten, molybdenum, quinine, and even opium. Japan, in turn, was seeking German technology: aircraft blueprints, torpedoes, radar systems, and anything that could give it an advantage. The I-52 departed from Japan bound for Europe. The objective was clear: reach the port of Lorient, controlled by the Nazis on the French coast. For the journey, the submarine carried about 2 tons of pure gold bars, as well as drugs, metals, and other valuable goods. In exchange, the Japanese hoped to load the vessel with cutting-edge military technology in Europe and bring it back. What made this mission different was that the I-52 was not traveling alone. A rendezvous had been coordinated in the middle of the Atlantic with a German submarine, the U-530. This meeting would allow the I-52 to receive an advanced radar system and other equipment to better evade enemies. All of this was to be done without being detected. But things did not go as planned. United States intelligence had already intercepted several Axis communications. Thanks to this, they learned the exact route of the Japanese submarine. On June 24, 1944, United States Navy anti-submarine aircraft approached the area and launched a barrage of explosive charges. The I-52 was hit and vanished without a trace. All the crew members died. The vessel sank in an area of the ocean where the depth reaches over 5 kilometers. For decades, its story remained frozen, surrounded by theories, rumors, and speculation. In the 1990s, a private underwater exploration group managed to locate the remains of the I-52. They found it southwest of the Azores, sunken and covered by decades of sediment. The images showed the submarine in good condition considering the time elapsed. The discovery reignited interest in its contents. Several of the rumors were confirmed. The gold was still inside. Researchers recorded numerous videos with underwater robots. They not only filmed parts of the hull, but also managed to see boxes and cylinders where the gold bars were stored. Despite the discovery, the extreme conditions made recovery nearly impossible. The gold inside the I-52 was intended to pay for the cargo the Japanese hoped to bring back: weapons, blueprints, radar systems, and other secret materials from the Germans. The plan was to maintain technical collaboration between both countries, even when the war already seemed lost for the Axis. The submarine thus became a symbol of that last desperate attempt to carry on. The existence of the I-52 also served to show how the Axis allies operated in the shadows. While the best-known battles took place in Europe or the Pacific, there were operations like this where tanks and planes were not the focus, but rather the secret exchanges that kept the war machine alive. The remains of the I-52 are still at the bottom of the sea. The gold was never recovered. Some private expeditions attempted to retrieve it, but none succeeded. The depths, the water pressure, and the high costs left the mission on indefinite hold. However, the recordings remain available as proof that it was all real. The case of the I-52 is one of the few documented examples where a submarine loaded with so much gold had a concrete mission between two Axis powers. It was not a simple military transport, but a high-level operation designed to keep the alliance alive when hope was almost gone. The Nazi time capsule that emerged in a Polish basement. In the year 2016, a group of workers was renovating an old building in the town of Zlocieniec in northwestern Poland when they made an unexpected discovery. Beneath the building's foundations, hidden in a concrete compartment, they found a sealed container bearing symbols of the Third Reich. What they had uncovered was a time capsule buried by the Nazis during the war. Zlocieniec, known as Falkenberg when under German control, was part of the territory that had belonged to Prussia before the borders shifted after the war. The site had housed a local school where the Nazis conducted propaganda and training activities. In the basement of that same building, 72 years later, the capsule was found. The construction team immediately reported the discovery to local authorities, who in turn contacted historians and staff from the regional museum. An operation was organized to open the capsule carefully, without damaging its contents. The procedure was carried out at the National Museum in Szczecin, in the presence of media and technical personnel. Inside the container were objects that clearly illustrated life in Nazi Germany, both politically and in everyday terms. There were 2 copies of Mein Kampf, several newspapers from the era, coins, photographs, and official documents. All were well preserved, thanks to the sealed state of the metal cylinder and the isolation of the compartment. The photographs showed scenes of the town under Nazi rule, including parades, buildings adorned with party flags, and portraits of local officials. Many of these materials were previously unknown and provided information that had not been documented with such accuracy. The newspapers, mostly dated from 1934, included reports on the regime, speeches by Hitler, and propaganda articles. Also found were pamphlets used to indoctrinate youth and school textbooks used in history classes at the time. Among the most striking objects were Nazi party medals and several leaflets referring to the oath to Hitler that students were required to recite. Documents listing the names of the students at that school in that year were also found, allowing for a more detailed reconstruction of the building's role as a political training center. Polish authorities indicated that the discovery held significant historical value, as it was not just a collection of objects, but a deliberately prepared capsule. The Nazis had buried it intentionally, knowing that someone would find it someday, and that their ideals and worldview would be preserved through it. The capsule had been mentioned in old German records, but until then it had not been located. Archive documents referred to a symbolic project at that school, with materials hidden as a legacy. However, no one had confirmed its actual location until that moment. The Szczecin Museum spent several months restoring and analyzing the items. Once cleaned and catalogued, they were displayed in a special exhibition. The exhibit attracted thousands of visitors and was covered by media outlets around the world, not only because of the historical value of the items, but also because of the emotional impact of seeing them intact after more than 7 decades. What stood out most was the contrast between the everyday objects, like pencils, books and coins, and the purely ideological items, such as insignias, proclamations and regime worship imagery. This combination made it clear how Nazi propaganda had infiltrated every aspect of daily life. The discovery also allowed researchers to trace connections with other similar findings in the region. It was confirmed that during the expansion of the Third Reich, many schools and public buildings had hidden time capsules as part of projects organized by the Hitler Youth and other party structures. Several of the recovered documents were digitized for research and public access. Personal letters from students were discovered, written in school notebooks, repeating party ideas as part of their exercises. This type of evidence helped illustrate how indoctrination was applied from a very early age. The capsule was placed in a reinforced display case within the museum, with specific temperature and humidity conditions. Its preservation is now ensured so that future generations can see it just as it was found. This discovery reignited interest in reviewing other construction archives from the Nazi era in the region, raising the possibility that more hidden capsules may exist. It also spurred new research into the educational practices of the Third Reich, as this case provided direct evidence of the materials used in classrooms. Zlosieniec, the small town where it all happened, organized educational events with local schools, using the discovery as a starting point to teach recent history. Several cultural and educational initiatives were launched thanks to this finding. The submarine shelter of Lorient, the Nazi fortress that survived total bombardment. During the German occupation of France, the port of Lorient became one of the most strategic installations for the Nazi Navy. It was not just an entry or exit point, it became a bomb-proof fortified base specifically designed to protect U-boat submarines, which were essential for the war in the Atlantic. Lorient, located in the Brittany region, was occupied by German troops in June of 1940. Shortly after, the German Naval High Command decided to build there one of the strongest bases in its network of bunkers across Europe. Construction began quickly, with thousands of workers, many of them forced laborers, erecting massive reinforced concrete structures directly on the harbor. The base was composed of several blocks of reinforced concrete, each serving as a shelter for submarines undergoing repairs, reloading, or maintenance. The structure was astonishing, roofs nearly 7 meters thick, designed to withstand direct aerial impacts. The walls were equally thick, and the entire base was prepared to continue operating even under attack. The construction was divided into 3 major complexes, Karaman 1, 2, and 3. Each had internal docks where submarines could float in. Once inside, gates were closed to keep them completely protected from the outside. This setup allowed the U-boat fleet to remain operational even while the surrounding cities were constantly bombed. Between 1941 and 1943, Lorient was one of the main launching points for submarines heading into the Atlantic. From there, missions of patrol, attack, and sabotage were deployed by the Kriegsmarine. The U-boats operated in groups and used Lorient as a base to reload torpedoes, switch crews, or receive direct orders from the German command. Aware of its importance, Allied aviation dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on Lorient. However, the submarine base withstood it all. The bombing destroyed much of the city, but the Karaman shelters remained standing. The concrete held firm, and the Germans continued using the base as usual. Faced with the impossibility of destroying the installations with conventional bombing, the Allies changed their strategy. Instead of attacking the base directly, they began devastating the surrounding city, aiming to cut supplies, eliminate infrastructure, and make life impossible for the German soldiers stationed in the area. By the end of 1944, Lorient was completely isolated. United States forces surrounded the area, and the Germans were trapped inside the base with no way to receive external aid. Despite this, they did not surrender. About 25,000 soldiers remained there until the end of the conflict, locked in but protected by a fortress that seemed indestructible. Inside the base were workshops, fuel depots, dormitories, kitchens, and offices. Everything was designed to withstand long sieges. There were independent generators, ventilation systems, and tunnels connecting different areas of the complex. Even under constant fire, internal activity never fully stopped. When the war ended, the Lorient base was not demolished. On the contrary, the French forces took it over and kept it in use. Its structure was so solid that it was more useful to preserve it than to attempt its destruction. For decades, the French Navy used it as part of their own naval operations. Today, the site has been transformed into a historic center and museum. Part of the facilities is open to the public, and visitors can tour some of the enormous hangars where the U-boats operated. There are also exhibitions with original objects, blueprints, uniforms, photographs, and videos explaining how everything worked. Karaman Block 3 is one of the best preserved. Inside, the marks of the rails, the gates, and the platforms where the submarines were placed for inspection are still visible. The acoustics and the scale of the site are impressive. It gives a clear sense of what it was like to move inside a base built to endure a full-scale war, the hidden Nazi city in Norway. During the Nazi occupation of Norway, the Germans established multiple military bases and operations centers throughout the country. But one of the most secretive projects took place in the north, in a mountainous area where they built an underground city that remained off the radar for decades. What appeared to be a small installation concealed a network of tunnels, warehouses, barracks, and advanced communication systems. The city was constructed in the Banak region, near Lakselv, in Finnmark, a remote area that offered strategic advantages due to its isolation and proximity to the Barents Sea. There, German engineers designed a self-sufficient complex that could operate without constant contact with the rest of the occupied territory. The main entrance was camouflaged. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a warehouse surrounded by forested land. But beyond that entrance was a tunnel system carved into the rock, with corridors leading to rooms, storage areas, power stations, and command spaces. The base functioned as a logistics hub and surveillance post to monitor naval movements in the Arctic. It also coordinated operations related to submarines and enemy convoys. Additionally, it served as a repair point for vehicles and heavy machinery used on the northern front. Dedicated generators, water wells, ventilation systems, and internal telephone lines were built. The entire system was created to survive without external support. The underground temperature remained stable, and there was enough space to house more than 200 people, including soldiers, technicians, and engineers. Much of the labor in the area was performed by Norwegians, forced to collaborate. Others were Soviet prisoners, brought in to carry out the heaviest tasks. Many of them died during the excavations due to the extreme climate, collapses, and the treatment they received from German officers. Construction materials arrived by train to Narvik and were then transported by truck to the main entrance. The operation was coordinated by members of the Todd organization, responsible for much of the Third Reich's infrastructure. The project was kept under strict secrecy, and very few civilians knew what was being built in the area. At the end of the war, the Germans destroyed part of the facility to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. However, several tunnels and rooms remained intact. For years, the site was sealed and forgotten until, in the 1990s, a group of local explorers rediscovered the original entrance. Upon entering, they found remnants of uniforms, ammunition boxes, rusted generators, and partial documentation. The overall condition of the site was surprisingly good, thanks to the dry climate and system design. There was no moisture or signs of looting. Everything seemed frozen in time. Norwegian authorities conducted an official expedition to the site in 1997. Each section was documented and a detailed report on the structure was created. The investigation confirmed that the site had been one of the most complete Nazi installations built outside Germany and that it had remained secret for over 50 years. Among the documents found were submarine route blueprints, Arctic maps, records of Allied naval movements, and personnel lists. Also discovered were photographs of the construction, taken by German engineers. These showed how the tunnel network expanded using specialized machinery. One of the most curious elements was a room with lead-lined walls, possibly used as protection against radio emissions or for encrypted communication experiments. This opened the door to new theories about the site's use not just as a base, but as a testing center. The underground city of Banak was not designed to be a simple fortress. It was a strategic node in the northern defense system. Its location allowed it to monitor escape routes of Allied convoys attempting to reach the USSR via the Barents Sea. From there, encrypted messages were also sent, and part of the logistics for the Arctic front was controlled. In 2002, the Norwegian government decided to preserve part of the site as a historical testament. Some sections were reinforced to prevent collapses, and monitoring sensors were installed. Currently, the site is not open to the public, but studies are underway to convert it into a visitable location for educational purposes. The area still bears signs of German activity, bullet casings, German language signs painted on the rock, and remnants of machinery. Despite the passage of time, the base maintains its original form, and its full size remains a subject of debate, as some areas have yet to be fully explored. Nazi weapons buried in Mendoza. In 2017, a group of rural workers was clearing land near San Carlos, in the province of Mendoza, when one of them noticed a metallic object protruding from the ground. Upon digging further, they came upon a heavy, rusted box marked with symbols that no one on the team immediately recognized. They thought it was scrap metal, but upon opening it, they discovered an arsenal with German engravings and Third Reich symbols. The discovery was immediately reported to local authorities, who arrived with personnel from the Argentine army. Upon inspecting the contents, they found several handguns, ammunition, long-range binoculars, a couple of deteriorated uniforms, and documents referencing the year 1945. All items were wrapped in thick cloths, protected from dust and moisture, as if they had been buried with the intention of being recovered someday. Experts who analyzed the contents confirmed that the weapons were of German manufacture, mostly Luger P08 and Walther P38 pistols, models widely used by Nazi officers during the war. The ammunition was rusted but mostly identifiable. Some documents were written in German, with dates and names that were later cross-checked with historical archives. One of the immediate theories was that the chest had been left there by one of the many Nazis who fled to South America after the war. Argentina was one of the countries that received the most German fugitives between 1945 and 1950, and Mendoza, like Bariloche or Córdoba, was home to several former military personnel and regime collaborators. According to investigators, the box had been buried about 60 centimeters deep, near an old abandoned winery. There were no visible structures around, suggesting the site had been deliberately chosen for its isolation. No other markers were found nearby, but a metal detector sweep was conducted in case of additional caches. Nothing else was found. Among the recovered documents were personal photographs, letters in German addressed to a supposed Captain Müller, and a small notebook with notes on routes, contacts, and movements within Argentina. An SS insignia in poor condition and an incomplete passport with old stamps were also found. The case was investigated by Argentine and German historians, working together to identify the possible owner of the cache. Although no definitive confirmation was reached, some clues pointed to a former logistics officer who had escaped via Italy and arrived in Buenos Aires in 1947. According to intelligence reports from the time, this man had lived under a false identity in rural areas for at least a decade. The box was taken to a laboratory in Buenos Aires, where the objects were cleaned, catalogued, and preserved. An immediate exhibition was avoided to prevent misinterpretations or interest from individuals with extremist ideologies. However, part of the material was handed over to the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires, where a special exhibit was created on the Nazi flight to South America. The discovery also reignited debates about the support network that allowed so many former Nazi military personnel to escape Nuremberg justice. Several escape routes, known as rat lines, passed through Italy, crossed the Atlantic on disguised ships, and landed in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Chile. This chest, buried in such a remote place, provided another clue as to how prepared some were to disappear without a trace. Experts agreed that the contents of the chest were not thrown together at random. The weapons were carefully packed, the ammunition well separated, the documents sealed in plastic, and the box had internal reinforcements to prevent it from being crushed by the weight of the soil. Everything indicated a well-planned and knowledgeable preparation. At the same time, immigration records from Mendoza province were reviewed. Although many names were missing or falsified, files of German citizens who had purchased land in the region between 1946 and 1952 were found. Some of them matched surnames mentioned in the notebook found in the chest. The Argentine government chose not to disclose the exact location of the discovery to prevent illegal searches. However, it did confirm that this was one of the best preserved finds related to the Nazi presence in the country. Contact was even established with researchers from the Wiesenthal Center to aid in tracking identities. The story gained international attention when a European news outlet published photographs of the contents. After that, several descendants of German immigrants in Argentina contacted authorities claiming to possess similar objects or period documents. Some of these materials were verified but not directly linked to the chest. The most intriguing question for investigators remained: why was the chest never recovered? If its owner had planned to return for it, what stopped him? Did he die beforehand? The answers remain unconfirmed, but the box stands as solid proof that many of those who fled arrived with plans, contacts, and hidden resources. Since then, other searches have been conducted near San Carlos. Some locals reported having seen strange movements in past decades, unmarked vehicles and men speaking German in the area. Though no further discoveries have been made, interest in uncovering the hidden past of the region remains alive. The Nazi documents that surfaced unexpectedly at a French school. In 2013, during renovation work at the Lucie Aubrac school in the town of Bourg-les-Valence in southeastern France, a group of workers operating in an old part of the building made an unexpected discovery. While removing wooden panels in an attic area, they uncovered a hidden cavity containing a large number of yellowed papers, old folders and envelopes bearing German seals. The school, built before the Second World War, had served during the occupation as a headquarters for German forces in the region. According to local records, the building was used as a temporary barracks between 1943 and 1944, before being abandoned by Axis troops during their retreat. After that, the school returned to its original function, and over the years, traces of its past were concealed. What the workers found that morning was a complete archive with more than 200 documents, many of them signed, stamped and written by German officers stationed in the area. There were also maps, urban plans marked in colour, lists of people, and some personal objects such as insignias, medals and photographs. Upon seeing the contents, the school's administration immediately notified municipal authorities, who in turn alerted the Ministry of Culture. Access to the discovery area was blocked off, and a controlled inventory began. Conservation and archival experts were sent to the site to assess the condition of the material. The papers were in acceptable condition, although some showed signs of moisture. Among the documents were surveillance reports, letters sent to superiors in Lyon, and files containing names, addresses and details about French citizens. Many of those individuals, as historians later verified, were connected to the local resistance or were of Jewish origin. Part of the archive referenced specific operations, including arrests, house searches and property confiscations. Lists of seized items were also found, from radios to bicycles. Everything was written precisely, in neat handwriting, and accompanied by exact dates. One of the most important documents was an intelligence report dated March of 1944. It detailed routes used by resistance groups to move between towns and hideouts. It also included code names, meeting points, and physical descriptions of suspects. That report had not previously appeared in official occupation records. A list of the school's children was also found, with handwritten notes. Apparently, the Germans were keeping track of students' families, especially in the final months of the occupation when internal control became more aggressive. Experts analyzing the find agreed that the archive had been deliberately hidden before the German withdrawal. It was neither buried nor scattered, but carefully packed and stored in a location inaccessible to students and staff. The choice of site suggested that someone with direct access to the building had done it. Among the items found was also a German-made portable typewriter, still with ribbon rolled inside. It worked, and was used to reproduce some of the documents originally typed on that very model. This helped confirm that much of the archive had been drafted right there, inside the school. The discovery surprised even the town's residents, many of whom were unaware the building had once served as a German headquarters. Some elderly locals recalled seeing soldiers coming and going, but did not know sensitive documents had been handled there. The news attracted media coverage across France. The Ministry of Culture transferred the archive to the Regional Conservation Centre in Grenoble, where partial restoration of the material was carried out. All the documents were also digitized to make them accessible to researchers and educational institutions. Part of the material was included in a temporary exhibition at the Resistance Museum in Lyon. Visitors were able to closely view the lists, the maps marked in red pencil, and the recovered photographs. The exhibit helped explain how the German army's local intelligence operated and how it intersected with the everyday lives of the town's inhabitants. The Nazi hideout found in the Paraguayan jungle. In 2015, a group of archaeologists working in the jungle region of San Pedro in northern Paraguay stumbled upon the remains of a structure hidden among the vegetation. At first, they thought it was part of an old rural construction, but after clearing the area, they found precisely cut stone walls, remnants of German ceramics, and symbols that pointed to a connection with Nazism. The site of the discovery lies near Ibicuí National Park, a remote area with difficult access. The research team, led by archaeologist José Barbosa, uncovered 3 separate buildings connected by camouflaged paths. There were no roofs, but the walls remained standing, and some still bore inscriptions in German. One of the most striking details was the discovery of Nazi-era coins, medicine bottles with German labels, and remains of small arms, such as empty magazines and shell casings. Everything indicated that the site had been used by people who came from Europe and had access to military and logistical items from the Third Reich. The archaeologists also found a swastika carved into a stone at the threshold of one of the entrances. Although weathered by time, it was still recognizable. Next to it, they uncovered a rusted metal box containing documents illegible due to moisture, though one still showed a date, 1947. The theory that emerged from the find was that it had been a hideout prepared by Nazis who fled to South America after the regime's collapse. The location was ideal, remote, hard to access, covered in dense jungle, and with no modern signs nearby. There were no nearby roads or registered properties. Experts analyzed the items and confirmed that many matched models produced in Germany between 1938 and 1944. The medicine bottles, for example, were identical to those used by the German army on the eastern fronts. Food cans were also found, with German labels and Reich seals. The construction style was also not native to the region. The walls were built with stacked stone using European technique, without mud or cement, but with exact joints. Everything indicated that the builders had experience in alpine or mountain architecture, something rare in that part of Paraguay. Despite the deterioration, several objects were recovered and taken to the National Museum of Paraguay. There, they were cleaned, catalogued, and stored in a special collection focused on German presence in the country. Some items were included in temporary exhibitions alongside historical migration documents. The discovery also prompted a review of Paraguay's immigration records from the post-war years. Several German names were found arriving between 1946 and 1952, many with false passports or incomplete documentation. Some of them had bought land near San Pedro and lived in isolation for years. Although there is no definitive proof of who used the hideout, researchers believe it served as a waypoint or temporary refuge. It lacked the conditions for long-term habitation, but was suitable for staying hidden for weeks or months while waiting for transfers or information. The Paraguayan government initially refrained from making public statements, but later allowed the archaeologists to continue their work with limited logistical support. Excavating other areas without authorization was prohibited to prevent looting or unauthorized searches by the curious. What made the case particularly interesting was that it wasn't the first time people had spoken of Nazi hideouts in Paraguay. Since the 1970s, rumors of bases in rural areas had circulated, but no concrete physical evidence had ever been found. This discovery changed that perception. The underground complex in Austria. In 2014, a group of researchers discovered a network of tunnels beneath an old factory near St. Gorgon and Dagusen in northern Austria. The area was already known for its connection to the Mauthausen concentration camp, but this find opened a new line of investigation, a possible secret center where the Nazis might have conducted experiments and covert technological work. Archaeologist Andreas Sulzer led the team responsible for examining the site. They used ground-penetrating sensors, and the results revealed passageways, large rooms, and structures not listed in any official records. Everything indicated that there was more underground than just abandoned storage spaces. According to testimonies collected by Sulzer, the complex was believed to be linked to the development of experimental weapons, possibly related to nuclear energy. Some of the materials found included metal remnants, old electrical components, and objects still partially buried. The site had been constructed using slave labor. Prisoners from Mauthausen were forced to excavate the tunnels and work in extreme conditions. The galleries were reinforced with thick concrete and steel, suggesting they were more than simple air raid shelters. One of the most striking aspects was the depth of some sections, reaching over 20 meters underground. Remains of wiring, damaged electrical panels, and ventilation structures were found. Everything was hidden beneath layers of soil and debris, as if someone had deliberately tried to seal it off. The Austrian government allowed limited excavations in certain areas, but given the site's high historical value and the presence of human remains nearby, restrictions were imposed to preserve potential evidence of war crimes. Even so, Sulzer's team managed to access several galleries. Historical documents made no direct reference to this site. However, declassified Soviet intelligence files mentioned a place called B8 Bergkristall, where prototypes of aircraft and special engines were supposedly developed. Some sources link that facility to the St. Georgen discovery. Symbols engraved on the walls were found, some featuring Gothic letters and Third Reich emblems. There were also remnants of furniture, mechanical parts, and a structure that resembled an improvised laboratory. Ventilation still worked partially, which allowed the team to enter without specialized equipment. They did not find definitive evidence of nuclear research, but there were signs of advanced technical work, remnants of tubes, gauges, and components not typical of a conventional factory. Deteriorated document fragments were also found, though illegible, bearing German seals. The area had been closed to the public since the 1950s. It was believed to contain only industrial ruins, but scanning equipment proved otherwise. The site had an organized layout with interconnected rooms and storage areas. Interest grew when international media began referring to it as the buried Nazi laboratory. While there was no conclusive proof of its exact function, everything suggested it was part of a special project. The combination of location, depth, materials, and secrecy sparked many theories. Sulzer stated that operations likely continued until the end of the war, as some sections showed signs of heavy use. The area had been bombed by the Allies, but the tunnels endured. That confirmed the construction was designed to last. The American bomber buried in the Alps. In 2013, a group of mountaineers following a little-used route in the Italian Alps discovered metal fragments protruding from the snow. Upon closer inspection, they realized these were parts of a large aircraft, some sections still attached. They were nearly buried, covered by ice and rocks. Authorities were called, and days later, US military experts arrived with Italian technicians. Initial analyses confirmed that the wreckage belonged to a B-24 Liberator, a bomber model used by the United States during the Second World War. A visible registration number on one wing allowed the exact aircraft to be traced. The plane had disappeared in 1945, and for decades nothing was known about its fate or that of its crew. It had departed from a base in southern Italy on a bombing mission, but never returned. Reports from the time stated that contact was lost after the aircraft crossed the Alps, with no radio signal or wreckage found. It was listed as missing with all crew on board. The discovery took place at more than 2,500 meters above sea level. The area was difficult to access, and the climate had helped preserve part of the structure. Though not intact, the fuselage still retained its general shape. The tail turret, part of the landing gear, and remnants of the cockpit were distinguishable. Experts found nameplates, fragments of uniforms, and several personal belongings of the crew. Among them were a watch, a box of letters, and a military ID. Human remains were also found, prompting DNA testing to identify the soldiers. The United States Department of Defense confirmed that the aircraft belonged to the 485th Bomb Group. Its mission that day was to attack a railway facility in Austria. It is believed that the plane was either hit by enemy fire or suffered a technical failure, veering off course and crashing into the mountain. The impact was severe, but part of the structure slid down the slope and became semi-buried in an area covered by snow nearly year-round. That is why it was never spotted from the air or by local residents. Only after that season's thaw did some fragments become visible. A special rescue operation was mounted to extract the remains without damaging the terrain or the aircraft. Work lasted for weeks, with pieces carefully removed using helicopters and manual tools. The most important parts were transferred to a US military base in Europe. Relatives of the crew members were contacted. Many had no idea what had happened to their family members, and some believed the bodies would never be recovered. The discovery closed a chapter for several families who finally received answers after nearly 70 years. Forensic tests identified 5 of the 11 crew members. Their remains were taken to the United States and buried with military honors. The other 6 could not be fully identified, but were also transferred and laid to rest in an official army cemetery. A section of the fuselage was preserved as a tribute in an aviation museum in Italy. A plaque was installed there with the names of all the crew and details of the mission. A ceremony was held with Italian and American officials to honor the fallen. The discovery also sparked an investigation into other aircraft that went missing in the region. Several bombing missions crossed the Alps in 1944 and 1945, and records show at least 10 planes did not return. Some believe they may still lie buried in similar areas. Military documents reviewed after the discovery showed that the flight had been listed as missing in action, with no further follow-up. Technology at the time did not allow precise tracking of aircraft. Many vanished without a trace and only resurfaced decades later. This case became one of the most significant aircraft recovery efforts in mountainous terrain. It demonstrated that even with the passage of time, fragments of history once thought lost forever can still be found and recovered. It also underscored the importance of air routes over the Alps during the war. All these findings remained hidden for years, buried, sealed, or abandoned in places no one ever checked again. They are not theories or reconstructions. They are real remnants of a war that left its mark all over the world. Each object, each structure, and each document found shows what that time was like without the need for further explanation. The past keeps resurfacing without warning, with evidence that continues to speak for itself.